Hello everyone, welcome to our Module 6 lecture where we'll be talking about supporting material, and this covers chapters 8 through 10 in your textbook. And so I'm going to do what I did last time, and that is go through a supplemental PowerPoint that's more detailed, and I will attach this PowerPoint as well. The PowerPoint that's been posted is still the standard for the class, and so please look through that also for any additional information for any quizzes coming up. But this gives you a really comprehensive idea of what we're talking about in chapters 8, 9, and 10. And so I'll go ahead and jump in. Like I said, I'll post this PowerPoint up on Module 6 as well. So today we're going to be talking about supporting material for our speeches, which is really the meat of our speech. This obviously goes under our main points. And so once we've established our thesis statement, our main points, then we can really get into the supporting material that we're going to use to help support our claim. And so as this slide states, supporting material illustrates and elaborates our point, it provides evidence, and it engages the audience. So like I said, this goes under your thesis, which is going to be the umbrella for your entire speech, and then you have main points. And then under each main point, you'll have supporting material that relates back to your main point, and the main point that relates back to your thesis. So there are going to be different types of supporting material that we're going to discuss, and the first one is examples. And obviously the definition of an example is pretty self-explanatory, but it's a typical instance of something. There are two different types of examples: brief examples and extended examples. Brief examples obviously include minimal detail, they're referenced only once, and they demonstrate a single point. Examples really help tie in what you're talking about, especially if the topic is unfamiliar to the audience. You can relate it back to something else to help them grasp the concept. And extended examples are also really great. They can involve analysis or data. They're referenced repeatedly, and they demonstrate diverse points. So this is basically an example that extends all the way through at least your main point or your speech, and it can help you really illustrate a complex concept. This falls under the category of an analogy. So if you're referencing a movie, you can give examples. For instance, the movie The Breakup is a really good example when talking about interpersonal communication, especially in romantic relationships. So you'll see that movie used as an example a lot when if you're in a class about interpersonal communication and conflict. So using that movie would be an example of an example. And if you used it all the way through your speech, that would be considered an extended example. Next, we're going to talk about stories. And so stories are things that obviously help add emotional investment, that pathos. It helps elicit a response from the audience. It really taps into the audience's what we call synthetic processing, and it just helps the audience relate back to what you're talking about. Stories can really help, again, illustrate and add vibrancy to your speech. They really do help with narrating and, again, applying the concept of your speech to multiple things, so it's really applicable. And so these can come in the form of anecdotes, brief stories, or extended narratives, and those obviously get longer as you go down the list. But anecdotes are something really brief. You can tell a brief story, which is a little bit longer, and then an extended narrative, which would be a really illustrative, detailed, descriptive story that helps you, again, has to tie back to that main point and is a supporting material. It should still relate back. Obviously, don't go on a tangent about a story that doesn't have anything to do with your thesis, but these just really help illustrate your point and, again, add that emotional investment. Next, we have testimonies. And so this includes firsthand findings, eyewitness accounts, and people's opinions generally. So this is when you use maybe quotes from an expert. When we're talking about expert testimony, this would be somebody's qualified opinion on something. So this would have to do, in the political sphere, if a political opinion piece that we see, posted in the New York Times all the time, that obviously is a qualified opinion. They're a journalist. They're usually a political scientist. They're highly credible and they're field specific. So this is a really great way to support your speech with logos, which would be the logic side of that. Having a qualified opinion can really emphasize your main point. For example, if you were going to talk about something in the medical field and you used a doctor's opinion, right, that would be expert testimony. So even on things like dog food brands, if it says like veterinarian recommended because whatever, that would be example of an expert testimony. Now, a lay testimony is someone that's just maybe observed the incident. It's not really an expert account and it's more general. So this would be like if a reporter interviews someone at a crime scene just to see what they had seen, their opinion on the subject matter. While this can still be credible, it's not as credible as an expert testimony simply because they're not necessarily qualified to be speaking on what they're talking about, and it's more of a general opinion. Next, we have facts and statistics. And so these are, again, really helpful in beefing up that logos aspect of your speech, that logical appeal. What to remember when talking about facts and statistic is you need to be specific. Don't just throw out a general number. We're not sure what that percentage means, or it's not in the correct context. And always cite your sources. So I don't know if anybody has watched How I Met Your Mother, but Barney always threw out, 83%, and he didn't ever cite where that came from because he was obviously making it up. So you need to cite all information that you get for a speech, but especially for facts and statistics, if you're not citing that information, it will lose all of its credibility. And then obviously use the information purposefully. If it doesn't add anything to your speech, if you're just using it to, check off a box on the citations, probably don't use it. You only want to use things that help, again, gain credibility for your argument, that, add to your thesis and your main points. So make sure you're using that information purposefully. So those are the types that we're talking about when we talk about types of supporting material. And so I'm going to go ahead and move on to chapter 9, which is how to find these credible sources in print and online. So here's a little scale of credibility that just basically talks about where we can find information and how credible it actually is going to be. So up here, it's going to start with the most credible and then move down to the least credible in case there's any confusion about that. But obviously, those peer-reviewed journals that you can find at the Texas Tech Library or the Texas Tech Library online that have been peer-reviewed and are published in research journals and things like that, those are the most credible sources of information that you can find, which is why academics primarily, if not always, only use peer-reviewed journals for their sources. Next, I know we are in the era of fake news and all that, but major news sources are usually pretty reliable and credible, especially when multiple of them are reporting on the same thing and it's not an opinion-based piece. That we're talking about objectivity here. If they are objective about something that's happened, it's very easy to quote the New York Times or anything that is published in a major news source. And next we'll move down to editorials and independent publications. Again, we're just kind of going down on the scale. These are less regulated. They're not necessarily as credible because they don't have the history and the credibility and the ethos behind them that things like major news sources do. And then finally, social media. So obviously we are told not to read everything or believe everything we read on Facebook and Twitter, and that is true. So make sure if you ever find a news article on Twitter that you always go back to the source and find where it's from. And the key of this is understanding the why of your source. So all of your sources are going to have some sort of bias towards them usually. And so finding out why they're saying what they're saying is really helpful, and to address that bias in your speech is even more helpful. And stating that you're aware that maybe this major news source has a political leaning, but you're not necessarily using them for their political commentary. You're using them as a credible source for something else. So addressing that and understanding the agenda basically of your sources that you're using is really important when giving an ethical speech. Next is we're going to use a mix of primary and secondary sources. So understanding the difference between primary and secondary sources is also really necessary and helpful. Primary sources are first-hand accounts or direct evidence of events, objects, or people. So this would be a primary source of something like the Constitution is obviously a primary document that it's the source that you're going to. You're not reading an opinion on the Constitution, you're actually reading the document itself. So anything that you know is a first-hand account or direct evidence of events, objects, or people falls under the category of primary sources. So this would be like a publication that conducted an experiment. So if you read about those in a peer-reviewed journal of an experiment and they post those findings, that will be a primary source because you are going back to the first people that did the experiment, discovered it, and things like that. A secondary source, which is actually much more common in our, just vast expanse of knowledge on the internet, they provide analysis or commentary about things not directly observed or created. So secondary sources, again, are political commentaries on things that are happening around the world. Anything that's not firsthand can fall under the secondary sources category. And so just make sure that you're using a mix of primary and secondary sources. When you're conducting a speech, you want to have solid evidence. And I'm not saying secondary sources are not credible or not reliable, but going back to the source is definitely important and helps build up your credibility and, again, just like beefs up that speech. So again, just some examples. Primary sources are personal knowledge and experience that you have. You can conduct interviews with people, which is a really good form of primary sources, or you can distribute surveys. Like I said, if you're doing an experiment, surveys are kind of just like that too, is you're conducting a poll. So a Twitter poll even is something that is a primary source about a question. Secondary sources, like I said, are pretty much anything that's not firsthand, such as blogs and social media news sites, books that are written about events. Obviously, a book about the Civil War is not a primary source because they were not alive during the Civil War, most likely. Newspapers and periodicals are all examples of secondary sources. Tips for finding quality, again, just going back to the importance of our sources. You want to make sure that everything you're using is credible and reliable, otherwise it will destroy your credibility as a speaker. Like I said, you want to prefer primary to secondary sources. You can utilize watchdog resources. So these are sources that are external that help you determine the credibility of websites and things like that. So you can go online and search how credible or reliable is so-and-so website, and you'll find reliable sources that fact check things like that. Follow links to other sources. Always go back as far as you can. So if you're on a article online and it links back to something else, you can follow that link just to make sure that their sources are from a credible source. Next is to evaluate the authorship. If an article doesn't have an author, unless it's from a government website or things like that, it's usually a cause for concern. So most reliable publications, even if they're about sports or things like that, there's always an author attached, and that adds a huge amount of credibility to a source. So I would definitely say it's a red flag if there is not an author listed. Also, you can check the currency. A lot of times things are outdated, and there's been a new experiment, for instance, that has come out that has debunked the previous one. So make sure if you're using, scientific evidence, you're not necessarily using something from the 70s, and we've looked up on reliability and recency of that. And then last, you can check the site's credibility. So .org and .gov are usually more credible than a .com source. Obviously, .com sources can still be credible and reliable, but a .org does, sources have to be established to a certain degree to obtain a .org status, such as NASA, that's .gov, right? So things like that, you can check and make sure it's from a reliable source that way as well. And finally, Chapter 10 is citing sources in your speeches. I know this is not necessarily the most fun thing to talk about, but it's important, especially to be ethical public speakers. You must cite your sources or it is plagiarism. So that's important to note, and we're going to talk about how to do that. Since this is a video and not a live class, I won't stay too long on this slide, and you're welcome to pause it, but this information is readily available on the internet as well. We use APA citations in communication studies. So for this, this would be an example of an academic journal article, which again, the most credible you can get. And so this would be how you cite that in a works cited page. For a speech, for outlines, you definitely still need a works cited page. And so anything you cite, this would be the way that you write it down. And then next, you have to alert your listeners to, I'll move this so you can see, key source information in your oral citation. So when you're citing orally, which is obviously what you do in speeches, you cannot just say, like I said, oh, 83% of doctors recommend this toothpaste brand, because you're not alerting your listeners to the source of that information, which again destroys your credibility. So different things you can include in your oral citation is the date of the source, so again establishes relevancy. The author of origin is almost always needed to be included. The type of source, if applicable, like a news or journal article from the New York Times, for example, and the title or description of the article. This one isn't always necessary, but it does add credibility. So usually our key standard or gold standard for an oral citation would be to include at least 2 of these in your oral citation. So again, the author or origin and type of source would be good. So maybe I'll use my name, Dr. Meredith Moore from Texas Tech University states that blah, 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 blah. So that's the type of source and origin. So things like that, just to incorporate at least 2 components of this into your oral citation to establish credibility. Here are some tips for your oral citation too. It gets really boring if you say the same thing every time you're citing something, especially if you cite things over and over again. So if I said, according to your textbook, like over and over again, that would get really redundant and you lose the audience's interest pretty fast. So tips for staying interesting is to vary the wording and alternate introductions of sources. So you can say, according to the New York Times, or Stacy reported, obviously you need to include her last name, but maybe Dr. Stacy reported in the New York Times that blah, 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 blah. So just make sure that you vary that a little bit just to keep things interesting. You can also vary the order in which you introduce your source, so discuss your findings first and then cite it afterwards, or you can state the source first and then your findings. Okay, well, just to make sure we covered everything, I'll just want to go back and prove that it's everything that's on your other PowerPoint. We talked about types of supporting material, our credible sources, types of sources. We talked about primary sources, which gives you even more examples there, and secondary sources, and then we discussed oral citations. So again, helps you avoid plagiarism, gives you credibility. These are all things I touched on in the lecture video, but go ahead and you can review this as well as a reminder. I'll go ahead and post the other PowerPoint as well, but if you have any questions about this material, please let me know, and I will see everyone on our next video conference. Thanks.